Hello and welcome back to the Stronghold. I'm the Magi, and if you've been around Arena the last couple of weeks, you know Insidious Roots is really having an impact. It seems like every content creator is throwing a list out there, and well, why should I be any different? Well, I'll tell you why. I should be different because I'm here for the budget, free-to-play, and new player community. So when I do a deck tech for this or anything else, I'm always doing it from that budget perspective. I have endeavored to do a very comprehensive deck tech here and really talk about every possible card that you might have, want to consider, what is the really core of the deck, and what you might want to consider crafting and what you might just want to pass over. In case you have been under the proverbial rock, Insidious Roots is a Golgari color enchantment that is black and green. Creature tokens you control have tap, add 1 mana of any color. Whenever one or more creature cards leave your graveyard, create a 0/1 green plant token, then put a +1/+1 counter on each plant token you control. When your deck is built properly, this absolutely goes insane, guys. So what do you say we take a look at how this deck should look for you? But before we get into all that, take just a moment to like, comment, and subscribe, because that kind of thing really keeps this boat moving. Now, what were we talking about? Oh yeah, right. Alright, so as we get into the deck tech portion of the video, I would like to take a moment and say thank you to those of you that are actually watching the video instead of just downloading the deck list and skipping the video itself. And allow us to have a moment of silence for the folks that just downloaded the deck list and pressed craft, because someone has done it and they have made a huge mistake. Okay, that's enough. So obviously this is not a finished polished deck. There's 91 cards in this deck to start off with, because we are going to have what I believe is a definitive conversation about every card to consider for this improved or budding archetype in Standard. The very first column on the far left is the core of the deck, and you heard me talking about the 9 slots to a budget deck and how I really like to have 5 of those slots be either cards that come to you free in your starter decks or things that are easily available in the current year. And this first column is all stuff that came out in this year, all commons and uncommons, really easy reach here. And as you can see, we've got 4 full slots in that alone. Fairy Dream Thief, 1 mana, 1/1 flyer. It surveils, so put things into your graveyard. It has an on-board or on-card ability when it's in the graveyard to allow you to remove it from the graveyard to not only trigger things that we're going to talk about within the deck, but of course draw you a card at the cost of a single life. You're going to see a lot of people running 4 of in this, but it is an uncommon that is kind of a late season card at this point. I think 2 is probably the right number, but of course if you have more, there's really no downside to having it. Snarling Gorehound from the current set, another 1-drop with evasion. Whenever another creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield under your control, surveil 1. So not only is it an evasive 1-drop, but it also facilitates repeatedly potentially putting things into your graveyard or fixing your draws. Rubblebelt Maverick, another 1-drop. This guy you basically want to throw out there, use him as a blocker. When he gets into the yard, he has an on-card ability to remove it from the graveyard to put a +1/+1 counter on a target creature. So you could use him as an early blocker, then remove him for a trigger, and then put that counter on something like Snarling Gorehound. Really interesting stuff. And before we get to the namesake card of the deck, of course, we also have to talk about the 4-drop 3/2 from Lost Caverns, Chupacabra Echo, which of course is an echo of a prior card available on Arena. This guy is your creature-based removal or part of your creature-based removal package. When it ETBs, target creature an opponent controls gets -X until end of turn, where X is the number of permanent cards in your graveyard. And of course, that is a huge thing in this deck because it's almost all creatures, it's almost all permanents. So like this can very easily drop like double digits down on an opponent's threat. Good stuff. And of course, the namesake card here, Insidious Roots, I think everybody has talked about this card at some point here in the last couple of weeks. It's awesome as an uncommon from the current set. Enchantment, Golgari, creature tokens you control have tap, add 1 mana of any color. Whenever one or more creature cards leave the graveyard, create a 0/1 green plant creature token, then put a +1/+1 counter on each plant you control. Pretty sick stuff there, really can get out of control. I hear a lot of people talking junk about this art, that they didn't give any direction, but to me the art is actually pretty plain that this was a piece that was actually commissioned for Lord of the Rings. If you look at the lower center there, that is very obviously a ring. This was artwork that Wizards commissioned and paid for and then didn't end up using in Lord of the Rings and is now very ingeniously reusing part of the cost savings initiatives that we've seen from Wizards of the Coast over the last couple of years. So, you know, don't talk junk about the art on this. It's actually kind of a good move from Wizards. From here, the second column moving over are other cards from this year that you might have hanging around in your collection, but don't really represent a core card for this deck. Certainly you can run them if you have them. They synergize, they fit the theme, but this is not anything I would consider crafting, but might fill some roles for you. Synod Scout with its Explore trigger may help you fix your draws or put cards in your graveyard. Placid Rottentail has an on-card ability from the graveyard to remove itself. Mosswood Dread Knight, we talked about this in Wildsville Dread Season as one of the best rares from that set for us budget players. Not only does it have built-in card advantage because of its Dread Whispers adventures, you draw a card and lose a life, it's a very efficient 2-mana 3/2 human knight with trample. And when it dies, it goes to the graveyard, and for the remainder of that turn or your next turn, you can cast its adventure and sort of recycle the card from the graveyard. So again, an on-card trigger removed from the graveyard, and this card kind of takes on a recurrence, self-fulfilling prophecy sort of thing. Cease and Desist, of course, Cease, exile up to 2 target cards from a single graveyard. Yes, that can be yours. Target player gains 2 life and draws a card. So kind of does all the things this deck is looking to do. Desist is also kind of no joke in the current meta because we've seen artifacts and enchantment decks all over the place, doing very big things in the standard meta for the last 2-3 years now. And for 6 mana at sorcery speed, you get to destroy all the artifacts or enchantments on the field. Sadly, that would include your own enchantments like Insidious Roots, but if you're far enough ahead and you've really got to stop your opponent, it is not that big a deal. And of course, this is more of a sideboard card for those that want to play best of 3. Next up, we got to talk about Agatha's Soul Cauldron because it does remove creatures from the graveyard. It is a mythic, though. I'm going to be honest, every time I see this card in a list, I kind of get the feeling that it is more of a win more card rather than a core part of the underlying concept. I don't really see it as super budget friendly, but you know what? We get like 20 mythics a set now on average, even as free-to-play budget players. So it's entirely possible that you've got a couple of these hanging around, and it's certainly worth testing. By all means, comment down below and tell me why I am underjudging this card. Next up, we've got Squirming Emergence, a 3-mana sorcery. This deck really wants to be doing things with permanents and primarily creature permanents. But for 3 mana, you get to return to the battlefield target non-land permanent. Boy, that was really awkward to say for some reason. From the graveyard with mana value less than or equal to the number of permanents in your graveyard. So once this deck has started going off a little bit, this could be like really anything. And of course, this can be your Insidious Roots that you're returning that maybe they finally dealt with. This can be one of your finishers. This can be just another trigger to build your board. Whatever it needs to do. I don't think it's part of the A team because, like I said, you want to be using permanents rather than sorceries. But again, you might very well have a couple of these and makes that proverbial 23rd card all the better. Another card from the current set that I think is on the B team is Chalk Outline. A lot of people want to build around this. I think it's just a little too restricted. But the nice thing here is it doubles that tokens entering the battlefield. It doubles the number of creatures that you get out of this. Because if you've got Insidious Roots and you remove a creature card, you get the plant token from Insidious Roots, plus Chalk Outline also gives you a 2/2 detective creature token. And then you get to investigate, so you get a third token onto the battlefield. This one, of course, you can't tap directly for mana, but you know, its card advantage and things like that might be a very budget-friendly version of the deck that runs one or two of these. Next up, we've got Blossoming Tortoise, another mythic from Wilds of Eldraine. This guy is really only in here in the conversation because it mills 3 cards, and you can return a land card from the graveyard to the battlefield. I definitely don't think this is ever going to be an all-star player in this deck. Next up, from the Jump-In collection from the current set, Azoni, Center of the World, legendary creature, Elf Detective, 5/4 for 6 mana with Menace. When it ETBs or attacks, you may collect evidence, i.e. removing things from your graveyard, not necessarily has to be creatures. If you do, create 2 2/1 black and green spider creature tokens with Menace and Reach. And of course, if you've got Insidious Roots in play, they also tap for mana. Really strong stuff. She also likes tokens. Sacrifice 4 tokens, surveil twice, put more things in your graveyard, draw 2 cards, card advantage, and gain 2 life, letting you outlast the aggro decks that are all over standard right now. Really, really strong. Again, not something I would craft, but a lot of you are going to have access to this card because of Jump In, and it certainly earns a place in here because God knows you're going to have enough tokens to not only do that sacrifice 4 tokens once, but maybe even 2, 3, or more times. It could get really, really ridiculous. And of course, she can win the game all by herself because a 5/4 with Menace is pretty hard to deal with. Last up in this category is the Virtue of Strength, and mostly it is the adventure ability here. Garen Brig Growth for 1 green mana. Return target creature or land card from your graveyard to your hand. And really, that's kind of what we're all about here is taking creatures out of the graveyard to trigger Insidious Roots. So again, I wouldn't necessarily craft this. It might be an easy cut in a later version of the deck, but it's not a bad way of doing it. The 7 mana enchantment that lets you tap your lands for 3 times as much mana really is not needed for this deck because Insidious Roots, if you have it in play, you're going to have more mana than you know what to do with and continue making more and more mana as your turn goes on. All right, now let's move the conversation to this third column, and this is all cards from this year's starter Golgari deck and last year's starter Golgari deck. I didn't go any further back than that. All of these cards fit this theme. They put cards into the graveyard, or they help you take cards out of the graveyard. So obviously just right on point. Most of these cards you're going to be familiar with, and I'm not going to talk about specifically, just really the highlights. And I want to start with the Ichor Drinker. This is the hardest working Phyrexian vampire out there. You got 2 copies on here, and again, that's why you see different quantities on different cards in this. Not because I think those are necessarily the right quantities, but that's the quantity that you potentially have for free. But again, Ichor Drinker, you've got 2 copies. 4 is not a bad idea because he shows up in the Phyrexian decks. He shows up in Vampires and now in the Graveyard Matters deck. So he's doing a lot of work, and throwing a couple extra commons into this, not a bad idea, particularly on a set that a lot of people did not open a lot of. For 1 mana, you get a 1/1 with lifelink. So again, he's part of this trifecta of really hard-working one-drop creatures. When he blocks for you, of course, he nullifies an attack. He's gaining you the life because of lifelink, and when he goes to the yard, he has an on-card ability to remove itself from the graveyard and incubate 2. So he's triggering Insidious Roots and creating a second token that has the ability to become a token creature and do all the cool things that token creatures do in this deck because of Insidious Roots. From there, I want to talk about Crawling Infestation, an uncommon, still standard and legal through the fall rotation coming up. You've got a 1/of enchantment. When it ETBs, you mill 2 cards. So, putting cards in graveyards, good things. Whenever 1 or more creature cards are put into the graveyard from anywhere during your turn, create a 1/1 green insect creature token. So it kind of flips the thing. When the creature goes in, now you get a benefit as opposed to just when it comes out. And obviously, insect creature token is good with Insidious Roots. And one of the other cards that I really wanted to talk about was Sky Fisher Spider. You've got 2 copies this year. A 3/3 with reach. One of the weaknesses that this deck has is to flying creatures. This helps nullify that a little bit. When it ETBs, you may sacrifice a creature. When you do, destroy target non-land permanent. So a lot of utility there, not only to kill your opponent's creatures, but anything they might have on the field that has become problematic. When a Sky Fisher Spider dies, you make a 1 life for each creature card in your graveyard. If you do, exile Sky Fisher Spider from the graveyard. So it allows you to gain life potentially, as well as get another creature leaves the graveyard trigger. And I think we have talked verbosely about how that is good in this deck. Dreadhound doesn't necessarily fit every aspect of this deck, but it was a 1/of in last year's Golgari deck. 6 mana, 6/6 at uncommon. So it's kind of a big dog, all puns intended, right from the start. When it ETBs, you mill 3 cards. So putting cards in graveyard is good. Whenever a creature dies or a creature card is put into the graveyard from your library, each opponent loses 1 life. So every time you mill yourself, you're potentially pinging down your opponent. Not necessarily something that I would even think about crafting specifically for this deck, but a 1/of copy added to your collection is not bad, because this card does a lot of work in areas like Brawl and stuff like that. So maybe something to consider if you don't have a copy already. And as I said, many of these cards come from last year's starter decks. So if you shake out your couch cushions, it's entirely possible that you have many of these cards already. All right, moving into a column number 4 here, we've got, what is that, like 7 rares here that I know you have that could play a role in this deck, because we don't make 0 rare decks around here all that often. First off, of course, we've got Llanowar Waste. This is the Golgari free dual land that came in your starter deck. In fact, all of these are from your starter decks. Grafted Butcher. When it ETBs, Phyrexians you control gain menace. Other Phyrexians get +1/+1. The interesting part here is 3 and a black, sacrifice an artifact or a creature, return Grafted Butcher from your graveyard to the battlefield. Good stuff. Could be a potential combat trick. Glisa Sunslayer doesn't really fit the archetype of the deck other than her colors, but she's one of the strongest free rares in the current budget year, and it's hard not to include her in the conversation. 3 mana, 3/3, first strike, Death Touch, which if you've never experienced it, is an absolutely brutal conversation. When it deals combat damage to a player, choose 1, draw a card, lose a life, destroy target enchantment, or remove up to 3 counters from target permanent. Is there going to be very tuned versions of this deck where you cut Glissa for a more synergistic card? Absolutely. Is that probably going to be your day one version? Probably not. So Glissa needs to be part of this conversation because she is just so strong on her own right. From here, pile up a 4 mana instant speed, Convoke, destroy target creature or planeswalker, and Surveil 2. So pretty nice here. Might add cards to your graveyard because of the Surveil trigger, but really just a powerful destroy target creature or planeswalker spell. And because it's Convoke, you might be able to cast this out of nowhere just because this deck is going to make so many tokens. Terror of Tawashi, 4 mana, 4/3, Phyrexian Ogre with Death Touch. So the Death Touch and the pretty beefy body for 4 mana is going to do a lot of work at holding the red zone for you. Whenever it attacks, you can pay 3 and a black. When you do, return target creature from the graveyard to the battlefield. So not only do you get that creature immediately back, but that is going to trigger Insidious Roots and maybe all sorts of other things, and really do a lot of work for you. Said creature is a Phyrexian in addition to its other types, and we have seen some other ways that that Phyrexian type can be relevant. My personal tech that I am adding to the conversation on Insidious Roots, like I said at the beginning, everyone has done a version of this, but I haven't seen anybody talking about this tech. Conduit of Worlds is part of your starter deck collection, 2 and 2 green artifact. You may play land cards from your graveyard. So you're milling a lot of cards, you're certainly going to hit lands. This allows you to basically make sure you never miss a land drop. In addition to that, if you are in a situation where you need to cast a spell which is in your graveyard, and don't forget, spells include creatures, and you're also in a position where you don't mind that being the only thing you do this turn, Conduit of Worlds allows you to do that. So if you've got Chupacabra's Echo in your graveyard and you need to cast him, you can do so with Conduit of Worlds, but you can't really do much else that turn as far as casting spells anyway. We've got some other tech pieces that partner with Conduit of Worlds in the land portion of the conversation. Last up, we've got the 5 mana Death Bloom Ritualist, 3/5 Alpha Warlock. Tap, add X mana of any one color, where X is the number of creature cards in your graveyard. This young lady can make a ton of mana. Of course, your deck already does that. So I think this is probably a proverbial 23rd card situation. If you needed to fill out your deck, great, but I think this is a really easy cut very early in the conversation as you start tuning this deck. From here, let's talk about 3 cards that I think are 3 potential easy crafts for this deck. First up, Seed of Hope, a common 1 green mana instant, mill 2 cards. You may put a permanent card from among the mill cards into your hand, so maybe get back an Insidious Roots or something like that, and you gain 2 life. This card does a huge amount of potential work in this deck. It's well worth the 4 common wild cards to add it to this deck if you have the slots to do so. But be forewarned, this card is not going to do work for you really anywhere else in the foreseeable future. Next up, we've got Ashnod's Harvester. First off, this is a 2 colorless mana uncommon from Brothers War. And it's in here kind of as a filler card for all of those low rarity unearthed creatures. Because of course, when you unearth them, they trigger things like Insidious Roots and everything else that goes with it, because the card removes itself from the graveyard in its unearthed process. Secondly, this particular one I chose as the poster child of that mechanic, because when it attacks, exile target card from a graveyard. So if you unearth it, you get a trigger. When you inevitably swing it that turn, you get another trigger. And if your opponent doesn't deal with this, it might trigger in its initial appearance on the battlefield multiple times. And it's a 3/1, so it tends to trade up pretty well. They're going to have to maybe throw something in front of it pretty beefy, but of course with 1 power, it dies to virtually everything. But as I said, getting it to the graveyard, death is only the beginning, am I right? From here, we've got Armored Scrap Gorger, an uncommon from the one set 2 mana Phyrexian Beast 03. If you are one of the Timmies out there that wants mono green to be great again, this is certainly going to be part of the conversation for the next year, year and a half. You can tap it, add 1 mana of any color. When it becomes tapped, exile target card from a graveyard. Hey, that's the thing we want to do, right? You put an oil counter on the Armored Scrap Gorger. When it has 3 or more oil counters on it, it becomes a 3/3. Just does so much work. You drop this on 2, it blocks pretty efficiently against those aggro decks, blocks out the 1 and 2 drops on mono red pretty much all day long. They gotta swing into it and then use a shock to take it out, whatever. And then very quickly, it becomes a potential threat on its own. And remember, it says when it becomes tapped, exile target creature, not when you tap it for mana. So once it's become a 3/3, if you start swinging with this guy, you get more triggers. Good stuff all the way around. You might have some of these if you shake out the couch cushions. If you don't, like I said, if you want mono green to be good, if you only run it in this deck, I think it's still probably worth 4 wild cards here to get those copies in your collection if they aren't there already. All right, moving along to column 6. These are cards at higher rarities that might very well be hanging out in your collection somewhere that are worth consideration in this deck if you already have them. However, I would not spend wild cards on any of the cards in this set, but again, if you have them, there's absolutely no reason to not run them, and you might find some hidden gems here that work pretty well for you. First up, we've got Deathcap Glade. This was the Golgari dual land from last year's starter decks. Willowgeist was from Jump In for last year, so a lot of people are going to have copies of this for you. Unfortunately, it was always kind of a tier 2, tier 3 jump-in deck, so it wasn't something that a lot of people went after aggressively. But another 1-drop, a 1/1 with Trample, a pretty relevant ability. Whenever 1 or more cards leave your graveyard, put a +1/+1 counter on Willowgeist. That trigger differs a little bit from Insidious Roots because the card leaving does not necessarily have to be a creature. So if you do end up running this and you put it out early, target your non-creature cards in your graveyard first, so that then when you have Insidious Roots online, you still have ammunition to trigger it. Furthermore, when Willowgeist dies, you gain life equal to its power. That can be a nice thing, especially in such an aggro-heavy environment. Shigeki Jukai Visionary, 2 mana, 1/3 legendary enchantment creature snake druid. Boy, that's a mouthful. This was literally in last year's starter decks. It has onboard abilities to remove itself from the graveyard, triggering all of those benefits. Next up, we've got Teachings, a great little saga. Chapter 1, mill 3 cards, create a creature token. Chapter 2, put a +1 counter on target creature you control. Doesn't have to be your spirit creature token, but that Chapter 1 almost always ensures that you have a valid target. Chapter 3, exile, return to the battlefield, transformed. It is a 1/1 snake monk. Whenever it attacks, choose 1, exile target creature card from a graveyard. When you do, create a 1/1 colorless spirit token. So triggers on top of triggers. Exile target non-creature card from your graveyard. Again, getting in on that Willowgeist style action. When you do, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. So maybe giving your Willowgeist an additional counter or 2 with that ability so that it tramples for lethal. Always good stuff. Graveyard Trespasser, if you've played mono black anytime in like the last 2.5 years, you have probably seen this card. The nice thing about it is when it ETBs or attacks, exile up to 1 target card from a graveyard. Again, doesn't have to be a creature. If it is a creature, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain a life. And of course, it also has a Day Bound bound side, when it flips over, it becomes a 4/4. And when it does so, and it ETBs or attacks, exile up to 2 target cards from the graveyard. So you get double triggers in that kind of corner case. Next, we've got Urborg Scavengers. When it ETBs or attacks, exile target card from a graveyard. Put a +1/+1 counter on Urborg Scavengers. Urborg Scavenger has flying as long as a card exiled with it has flying. Same is true for First Strike, Double Strike, Death Touch, Haste, Hexproof, Indestructible, Lifelink, Menace, Reach, Trample, Vigilance. This is not a card that I would craft, but if you've got one, it has the potential to be a real all-star in this deck. Of course, it dies to removal in its own right, well, you've got a lot of all-stars in this deck. That's why I say I wouldn't craft it. But if you do have it, there are a lot of potential abilities built into this deck to potentially feed Urborg Scavengers and make it even bigger. The Dream Thief has flying, Gorehound has menace. Let me see here, that is just an explore trigger, vigilance. Let's see here, what else we got? Lifelink. I think that might be all the really super good. Oh, Reach, there's a good one that could be very relevant. First Strike, Death Touch, another Death Touch, just so many good potential abilities there that Scavengers can cannibalize on and make itself really big and problematic. Next up, we've got Simulacrum, a 3-mana 2/1 artifact creature ape. When it ETBs, put 2 +1 counters on a target creature you control. This one's in here for 2 reasons. One, it was part of last year's Jump In collection. And of course, Unearth is a very nice ability on this because you get to do it multiple times and get all those other benefits when it leaves the graveyard. A card from last year's starter collection, Old Rutstein. When it ETBs and at the beginning of your upkeep, mill a card. If a land card is milled this way, create a treasure token. If a creature card is milled this way, create a 1/1 green insect creature token. If a non-creature, non-land card is milled this way, create a blood token. Again, wouldn't craft this, but you might have a copy hanging around down on the couch cushions that you've forgotten about. And yeah, that does a lot of work here. Basically gives you something no matter what. It's just an absolute value engine. Let's see here, actually from this year, so it's kind of in the wrong column here, but we'll talk about it here. Micro Tyrant, power and toughness are each equal to the number of creatures you control that are fungi and saprolings. Big deal, no real synergy there so far. But a 3-mana XX Elder Fungus legendary creature. The interesting part is at the beginning of your end step, create X 1/1 black fungus creature tokens with this creature can't block, where X is the number of times that you descended this turn, which if you forgot, descended is a permanent card is put into your graveyard from anywhere. So you might do that 2 or 3 times in a turn. Potentially good stuff there. Again, I would not craft this card, but if you already have one, it's well worth the conversation. And we're going to go ahead and move that to the other part of the list. Oh, not there, right there. Okay. Next up, how about this from the Wayback Machine? Dollhouse of Horrors from last year's starter decks. 5-mana artifact. 1, tap. Exile creature card from your graveyard. Hey, we already like that. Taking things out of our graveyard is good. Create a token that's a copy of the exile card, except it's a 0/0 construct artifact in addition to its other creature types, and has this creature card gets +1/+1 for each construct you control. It gains haste until end of turn, activate only as a sorcery. So it removes things from your graveyard, it makes token creatures that get bigger the more of them you do. And like I said, this was part of last year's starters, so if you were around last year, you have a copy of this card. And it got so much hype the first couple weeks after it was added on to Arena, and then everyone decided it was just kind of a meme card and didn't do anything. But if you've got a slot for a 5 mana artifact, it can potentially do a lot of work in this deck, particularly for a card that you may already own. Next up, Old Stick Fingers, another card from last year's starter decks. Legendary, Horror, X, and Golgari. When you cast a spell, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal X creature cards. Not X cards, X creature cards. Put all creature cards revealed this way into your graveyard, then put the rest on the bottom of your library, so all the non-creature cards go back in a random order. Its power and toughness are equal to the number of creature cards in your graveyard. So not only did you make yourself a potentially very big creature here, and you have a huge potential late game mana creating engine here, but you refilled your graveyard with a lot of creatures to then do other shenanigans with. So a card that can really do a lot of work, but again, wouldn't necessarily craft this card if you don't already have it. All right, moving into the last column of cards that we are going to talk about. If you notice up to this point, everything that we have talked about, I have either recommended because you already own it or may already own it. Very few things were really recommended as crafting, with the possible exception of these 3 cards here in column 5. Now we're going to talk about the cards that I do actually think are worth adding to your collection. They're worthwhile cards. And yeah, you guessed it, there's more than 5 cards here, although there are many cards here that I have already recommended in previous builds. So hopefully you've already made some of these investments. First up, we have the legendary lands from Kamigawa, in this case, the black and green. The black Abandoned Mire in particular fits very, very well here because when you use its spell-like channel ability from your hand, you mill 3 cards and then return a creature or planeswalker card from your graveyard to your hand. Trigger, trigger, trigger. This ability costs 1 less to activate for each legendary creature you control. There are some legendaries in this deck that will help bring that down. Azoni, oh god, what else we got here? Actually, no, Old Stick Fingers, Old Rudstein, all of those are legendaries. Terror is not, and neither is Grafted Butcher. So there are a couple things to maybe bring that down, but probably not any part of your build arounds. Besiegio, 2 mana, destroy target artifact, enchantment, or non-basic land opponent controls. That player may search their library for a land card with a basic land type, put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle. This ability costs 1 less to activate for each legendary creature you control. So again, a little bit of potential cost reduction, but anything more than 1 is kind of a moot point. The nice thing about these, yes, they're only going to be legal in Standard for about 6 more months or so, but these are going to continue 1-of copies to do work in Standard for that 6 months and well beyond. Not only do these have great Brawl applications, but you're going to use these in constructed Eternal formats probably until the end of time. The nice trick about them for this deck is if you have Conduit of Worlds, now those cards play double duty because you can use their on-card spell-like ability, use that ability, it goes to the graveyard. You can't necessarily return it back to your hand to reuse the spell-like ability, but you can play it from the graveyard as a land and get double work out of that spell. Next up, we've got Restless Cottage. This I actually recommended as a craft for the Golgari deck that we looked at during the Wilds of Eldraine season, the ill-fated food deck. But yet, here it is again. This card just does so well. This deck is going to go extremely wide with tokens, and at some point, your control decks are going to have to hit the emergency board wipe button. Then you've got a man land that does 4/4 right off the bat. Still activatable. Maybe that helps you close out the game. When it attacks, you create a food token to help you continue to last against the control deck and maybe buy you those extra turns that you need for something like Restless Cottage to kind of close out the game for you or allow you to start rebuilding your board state. Another thing that goes very well with Condo of the Worlds, even as a single copy, Demolition Field, an uncommon from Brothers of War. It taps for colorless mana, so it does dilute your mana base a little bit, but for 2 mana, tap and sacrifice it, destroy target non-basic land an opponent controls. That land's controller may search up their library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle. You may search your library for a basic land card and put it onto the battlefield as well. The nice thing is, if you are following my advice and not spending your wild cards on things like dual lands first, and you're going up against a wealthier deck opponent that maybe is chock full of dual lands, they are going to run out of basics before you do. So you can keep recycling this and eventually just straight up destroying their mana base turn after turn after turn, while you're still adding lands to your land count turn after turn. It does a huge amount of work. It's an uncommon. If you don't already have a copy, it's certainly worth an uncommon wild card for this deck alone, but you will build this in other decks as well. And Brothers War was certainly not the first time that this card was printed on Arena. So if you shake out those couch cushions, you might find that you have an older version of the card somewhere in your collection as well. Mirex, one of those weird corner case rare lands. Again, it taps only for colorless mana, so it does dilute your mana base. Have to give you that. It does maybe do a little bit of an impression of fixing your mana base in a very narrow field. You can tap it for 1 mana of any color, but you can only do that the turn it entered the battlefield. The nice thing is, if you have some way of sending this to the graveyard and then recurring it, you might get second or maybe even third uses out of that. The reason that this card is becoming more and more budget relevant, though, is its third activated ability. Pay 3, tap, create a 1/1 colorless Phyrexian Might artifact creature token. Boy, that's a mouthful. It has Toxic, and this creature can't block. So this is starting to see more and more play in the Phyrexian decks, in the Toxic decks, and now in a graveyard recursion, tokens matter style. I've never recommended this card for crafting, but it is seeing more and more play, and I think having a one-of copy of this in your collection is probably a smart play at this point. Moving down, this is actually part of that tech package for Conduit of Worlds that I keep talking about. This one is from Streets of New Capenna, so it's only again going to be in Standard for about another 6 months, but it's a common, and having 1 copy of this will do so much work for you. If you're not familiar with it, as it enters, it immediately sacrifices itself. You search your library for a basic, swamp, mountain, or forest, so it grabs any basic in the deck, put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle, you gain a life. So you could do this with Conduit of the Worlds every single turn to gain life and strip basics out, so when you draw a card, you're more likely to draw gas. It does so much work. Even 1 common wild card here is a big, huge positive investment for this little tech package that we have talked about. You can even do this just to gain the life with Conduit of Worlds every single turn, even if you fail to find a swamp or forest because you've already stripped them out. If all you need is that extra life to help you stick in the game and stay a little bit longer. Next up is Thran Portal, a card that I have recommended many times. This is the universal dual land this year, or very close to it, that will fit in every one of your 2 or 3 or 4 color decks, 5 color if you're just an absolute maniac. It's kind of like a pain land, but not quite as good, because when it ETBs, you have to choose a color, and then that is the color that it's going to be. And every time you tap it for mana, it pings you for 1 life. So not quite as good as a dual land, but versatility makes it a 1 copy craft that I think everyone should have in their collection right now. Tenacious Underdog, another one of those cards that I think everyone should have, and for this deck, you only need the one copy. This card was also in last year's starter deck collections, so again, shake out those couch cushions. You probably have a copy of this if you've been around for a little while. The nice thing about this is it's a 2-mana 3/2. It has Blitz, so you can pay 2 and 2 black and 2 life. You may cast Tenacious Underdog from your graveyard using the Blitz ability. So it comes in, does its attack thing for 3/2. Very, very cool. When it dies, you draw a card, so it gives you some card advantage, and we've talked about ways of making your card advantage much better by stripping away things like your dual lands, and then it goes back to the graveyard. So you could do this again, turn after turn after turn, to get all those other benefits of other things going on. Tyvar, a rare card from the one set, 3 mana, 3 loyalty, Tyvar, legendary planeswalker. Its base ability, you may activate abilities of creatures you control as though they have haste. Remember, Insidious Roots, all of your creature tokens can tap for mana. Now they tap for mana the turn they were created. Just really gets very, very silly. Its +1 ability allows you to untap up to 1 target creature. Maybe you want that to be something like, oh, where did it go? Your Scrap Gorger, for instance, so you could get another mana out of it. But really what you want to be doing on Tyvar as soon as it comes into play is using its -2 ability. Mill 3 cards, you then may return a creature card with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. And remember, it's going to have haste. And because you removed it from the graveyard, Insidious Roots is going to trigger. You're going to get 1 or more additional tokens. That token can be tapped for mana and also has haste. Leaving Tyvar at 1 is not really as scary as it is here, because more than likely either the creature that you returned or the corresponding token that it created is going to be able to help defend Tyvar, and you're going to have a lot of defensive creatures on the board unless you just swung for the win, in which case, who cares? You already won. The last card in this conversation is going to be Virtue of Persistence. Of course, we all know the 2 mana Lock the Wane, Scorn, sorcery speed, target creature gets -3 until end of turn, and you gain 2 life. So very nice removal. Built-in card advantage just because of the adventure. If you do get to the point where you can cast a 7 mana enchantment, and in this deck, you probably will, because you're going to have more mana than you know what to do with. Once that happens, at the beginning of your upkeep, put target creature card from your graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. So things just get dumb at that point. It's very possible that this is a win more card, but this certainly is not going to be the only deck that you use it in. If you don't already have a copy, I would highly recommend crafting it and get used to start playing it, not only here, but in mono black and a lot of other builds as well. But that is the basic overview of the deck. Like I said, don't craft this list. There's no magic to having 91 cards in this list, but these cards are all here to help you start filtering through what exists in your particular collection, maybe things that you've forgotten about, things like that, and then whittle this down to a more effective 60 card deck based on what you own, and then ignoring the cards that you don't. Again, column 1 I think are kind of the staples from the current year, and I don't know that I would try and build this deck without those 4 slots worth of cards existing. A lot of those you might not have today, but a lot of them you will have by the end of the current season as you continue to collect, draft, and open packs for the current Murders of Karlov Manor set. So if you need to, be a little bit patient. Let those cards come to you, and I think 99% of people out there can build this deck for free, although I do think there's about a dozen cards here that are probably worth consideration for crafting if you don't have them already. All right, so as you can see, this deck tech ended up being insanely long because I really wanted it to be super comprehensive so that you could build this deck with the goal of spending 0 wildcards and just using what you have, yet still being very effective. Believe it or not, I've got like another 30 minutes of game footage shot for this that I had planned on including, but obviously now I'm not. So if you're catching this video within the first 5 days of release, that is still going to be available over on Twitch. And if you're catching this video later in the season after those initial 5 days, that same footage is going to be available on my Patreon and not behind a paywall. It's going to be there for everyone, even at the free level. And before we go, I want to take just a moment to thank my totally awesome patrons for supporting me and allowing me to apply my passion into a community. And of course, before we go, I've got some suggestions for your next step.